Welcome to the world of daily life stories. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss new stories. Enjoy listening. The attic was silent, save for the occasional creak of the wooden beams overhead and the rustle of cardboard boxes shifting as Aaliyah and Amara worked their way through the years of forgotten family history. It was an afternoon in late autumn, the sun filtering through the dusty windows in thin rays that illuminated the forgotten relics of their past. The sisters, both in their late 20s, had spent the better part of the day sifting through their late grandmother's belongings. The task, while heavy with the weight of memories, was also bittersweet, marking the final chapter of their grandmother's legacy. Their mother had insisted that they tackle it, but it was a responsibility neither of them had been eager to shoulder. Aaliyah, the more adventurous of the two, had been the first to pull a box from the corner, brushing off the dust that had settled there. Amara, on the other hand, took a more thoughtful approach, carefully inspecting each box before making her next move. Aaliyah, with her short-cropped black hair and a penchant for action over contemplation, had been excited about getting the job done. She had always been the one to dive headfirst into any situation, not necessarily out of impulsiveness, but rather from a desire to see things through quickly. Amara, with her long, flowing chestnut hair and a more cautious demeanor, found comfort in taking her time, deliberating over every decision. Despite their differences, the two sisters had always shared a deep bond, their contrasting personalities often balancing each other out. The attic, though cramped and cluttered, was the final resting place of their grandmother's memories, old photographs, journals, and trinkets from a life well lived. Each item seemed to tell a story, yet many were too faded to make out, hidden beneath layers of time and dust. Aaliyah was the first to spot something unusual. "Hey, look at this," she called out, her voice cutting through the stillness of the attic. Her hand held up a small, unassuming cardboard box, its edges worn but still intact. The box had been tucked away beneath a stack of journals, the words "Ancestry Journey" printed across the front in bold, faded letters. Amara looked over, her curiosity piqued. "What is it?" she asked, moving closer to inspect the item in her sister's hands. Aaliyah turned the box over, her fingers brushing over the worn surface. "It looks like some kind of ancestry DNA test," she said, raising an eyebrow. "Do you think Grandma ever planned on taking one of these?" Amara tilted her head, scrutinizing the box for any clues. "I don't know. I never heard her mention anything about it. But if it's here, maybe she was thinking about it. Or maybe it was a gift." Aaliyah shook her head with a smirk. "Maybe we can finish what she started. Could be fun, right? We can see if we find anything cool in our family history." The idea seemed trivial at first, a fun, light-hearted diversion in an otherwise somber day. But as Amara glanced over the box, she couldn't help but feel a strange sense of intrigue. The DNA test was unopened, its contents pristine and untouched by time. It felt almost as if their grandmother had meant for someone to discover it, someone who would unravel the mystery of her ancestry. Amara, the more meticulous of the two, set down the box and began to carefully read through the instruction sheet. She wasn't particularly fond of surprises, and she wanted to make sure they followed the process exactly as it was outlined. Aaliyah, on the other hand, had already torn open the box, revealing 2 sealed vials, a prepaid envelope, and the small instruction pamphlet. "Come on, Amara," Aaliyah said impatiently. "We'll follow the instructions later. Let's just get this done." With a grin, Aaliyah quickly opened one of the vials and removed the cotton swab inside. Before Amara could protest, she was already swabbing the inside of her cheek. Amara sighed but couldn't help smiling at her sister's impulsive nature. Despite herself, she felt a flicker of excitement. Maybe there was something fascinating in their family history they hadn't known about. Aaliyah had always been the type to take risks, and this, while seemingly small, felt like one of those moments. After all, what harm could come from a DNA test? Amara followed suit, albeit more cautiously. She swabbed the inside of her cheek, then carefully placed the sample in the vial, sealing it tightly. They both sealed the other vial and placed them in the prepaid envelope. The task was done within minutes, and Amara couldn't help but laugh at the simplicity of it. They had just sent away for their family's genetic history with barely a second thought. As they walked down the stairs, their footsteps echoing in the empty house, Amara couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It was as if their grandmother had left this test for them to find for a reason, though neither of them could have known how the discovery would unfold. Weeks passed before the results came in. Life, as it often does, moved forward. The twins had put the DNA test out of their minds, caught up in the demands of their daily lives. But one evening, as they were both sitting at the kitchen table, each caught in their own world, Amara's phone buzzed. It was an email notification, one they had nearly forgotten about. "Hey, Aaliyah, the results are in," Amara said, her voice strangely soft. She opened the email, and the familiar website for Ancestry DNA appeared on the screen. Aaliyah leaned over her shoulder, her excitement rekindled. "Let's see what we're made of," Aaliyah joked, but Amara's face had already grown pale as she read through the email. The results were more than either of them could have imagined. Their DNA test had not only linked them to various distant relatives, they had also found a connection to a decades-old criminal investigation, one that had been buried for years. Names, places, and dates began to emerge on the screen, names neither of them recognized, but whose stories would soon change their lives forever. The twins sat frozen, the words on the screen impossible to believe. Then, as if to confirm their worst fears, their phone rang. It was their family doctor, Dr. Carter, a man they had known since childhood. His voice was calm but firm as he spoke. "I need you to sit down," Dr. Carter said, his tone unsettling. "I need you to understand something. Your DNA test results, they're linked to a crime that occurred nearly 3 decades ago. You need to come in, and we need to talk about this right away." The air around the sisters grew thick, the weight of the news sinking in like a heavy fog. What had they uncovered? What were they now a part of? And just like that, the ordinary life they had known was shattered. Secrets, long hidden, began to surface, and their family's darkest history was about to unfold in ways they could never have predicted. Their hearts raced as the reality of what was happening slowly dawned on them. Aaliyah and Amara had never imagined that a simple, seemingly harmless DNA test could unravel everything they had ever known about themselves and their family. But now, they were about to be swept up in a story far bigger than either of them could have imagined. The past, buried beneath layers of time, was coming to life, and its secrets would change everything. The phone call ended abruptly, and the room was silent except for the sound of their breath. "What do we do now?" Amara whispered, her voice barely audible. Aaliyah stood up, her pulse quickening. "We go to the doctor. We find out what this is all about. We don't back down." And so, their journey into a tangled web of mystery, crime, and family secrets began. Neither of them knew it then, but this was just the beginning of a revelation that would change their lives, and their perception of the world, forever. The drive to Dr. Carter's office felt like an eternity. The roads, usually familiar and comforting, now seemed foreign and ominous. Aaliyah gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white from the pressure, her mind racing through 1,000 questions. How could a simple DNA test reveal something so sinister? What was it they had stumbled upon, and why did Dr. Carter's voice carry that urgency, that chill? Beside her, Amara sat in silence, her face pale, her gaze fixed on the passing scenery, though her mind was far from the outside world. The weight of the information that had just been thrust upon them sat heavily on her chest, suffocating her. She couldn't wrap her head around it. DNA test results linked to a crime? How could that be possible? Her thoughts spiraled, and 1,000 scenarios played out in her mind, each more terrifying than the last. "Do you think he's just overreacting?" Amara asked softly, her voice breaking the silence like a whisper in the wind. Aaliyah glanced over at her, her lips pressed into a thin line. "I don't know. But something's not right. This isn't just about a distant relative or a fun ancestry discovery anymore. There's something bigger at play here. And if Dr. Carter thinks it's serious enough to call us in, we need to take it seriously." Amara nodded but didn't say anything more. The weight of the unknown was too heavy to bear in the moment. What had they uncovered? How could their family's history be so entangled in something so dark? The questions churned in their minds, but none of them had answers. The drive seemed endless, and just when Amara thought she might crack under the pressure, Aaliyah pulled into the parking lot of Dr. Carter's office. The small, unassuming building sat quietly at the corner of the street, its windows reflecting the fading light of the evening. For all its normalcy, it now seemed like a place filled with dread. A place where the truth would unfold, but at what cost? They both stepped out of the car, their movements slow, deliberate, as if the gravity of the situation was weighing them down. As they walked into the office, the familiar hum of fluorescent lights above them seemed to mock their apprehension. The receptionist, a young woman with a friendly smile, greeted them with a soft, "Good evening," but her greeting fell on deaf ears. The twins, both lost in their thoughts, barely acknowledged her as they took a seat in the waiting area. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, each second a reminder that something life-altering was about to unfold. The door to Dr. Carter's office finally opened, and the familiar face of their family doctor appeared in the doorway. His kind, warm expression was now replaced with an air of seriousness that immediately put them both on edge. "Come on in," he said, his voice calm but tinged with something else, something that made their hearts race even faster. Aaliyah and Amara exchanged a glance before standing up and following him into his office. The walls were lined with medical certificates and family photos, a comforting backdrop that did little to quell the unease that had settled in their stomachs. Dr. Carter gestured for them to sit, and they did, their bodies tense as they took their places across from him. The doctor closed the door behind them, his movements deliberate, and then sat down at his desk. He folded his hands in front of him, his gaze never leaving the twins. "I'm sure you're both wondering what this is all about," Dr. Carter began, his voice steady, yet there was an edge to it that made the words sound more like a prelude to bad news than a simple explanation. "I've seen a lot of things in my years of practice, but this is different. The DNA results you sent in, they didn't just show distant relatives. They're tied to something far more significant." Aaliyah leaned forward, her voice cutting through the tension. "What do you mean? What kind of crime are we talking about?" Dr. Carter's expression darkened. "It's difficult to explain without giving you all the details, but I'll start by saying this. The DNA test linked you both to a case I never thought I would have to bring up again. A case that was closed many years ago, but apparently not fully solved." Amara's stomach churned as she exchanged a worried glance with Aaliyah. "What kind of case?" Amara asked, her voice trembling slightly. She hated the uncertainty, the way this conversation was making her feel like they were caught in a web they had no hope of escaping. Dr. Carter hesitated before speaking again, choosing his words carefully. "It's a murder case. A brutal one. A case that took place nearly 30 years ago, when you two were just children. And somehow, your DNA came up as a match to someone involved in that case." The room seemed to shrink around them. "Murder. A case from 30 years ago." Aaliyah's breath caught in her throat. "You're telling us that we're connected to a murder? How is that even possible?" "I know this is hard to hear, but the connection is undeniable," Dr. Carter said softly. "I've looked over the results myself, and they've been cross-checked with the authorities. The link is there, and it's not something that can be dismissed easily. I wanted to bring this to your attention before the situation escalates further." Aaliyah stood up suddenly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "This doesn't make sense," she snapped, her voice rising. "How could we be connected to something like this? Our family, we've never been involved in anything like this." Amara, her voice barely above a whisper, added, "What do you mean by involved? Is this about our parents? Our grandparents?" Dr. Carter shook his head. "I don't have all the details, but there are connections to your family, specifically to your grandmother. That's why I called you here. I didn't want you to find out about this from anyone else." Aaliyah's hands clenched into fists at her sides. The idea that her grandmother, the woman they had just mourned, might have been involved in something so horrific was impossible to comprehend. It felt like a bad dream, one she couldn't wake up from. "What are you saying? That our grandmother was somehow connected to this murder?" "I'm not saying she was directly involved," Dr. Carter replied, "but there are certain things about her past that don't add up. I've been reviewing some old medical records, and there's a connection to a man named Victor Cole. He was one of the primary suspects in the case. And according to the DNA results, there's a link between you both and his family." Victor Cole. The name sent a shiver down Aaliyah's spine. She had never heard of him, but the way Dr. Carter spoke about him made it clear he wasn't someone to be taken lightly. Amara's voice cracked as she spoke. "But what does this mean for us? Are we in danger?" Dr. Carter's gaze softened, but his expression remained grim. "I don't know yet. But what I do know is that there are people who haven't forgotten about the case. People who still believe that justice wasn't fully served. You two are now part of that story, and whatever secrets have been hidden for so long, they're starting to resurface. If I were you, I'd be prepared for what's coming next." Aaliyah felt the room close in on her. Her heart pounded in her chest, and she had to fight the urge to scream, to run away from the terrifying reality that was unfolding before her. It wasn't just a test result, it was an unraveling of everything they thought they knew about their family, their past, and their very identity. For the first time in her life, Aaliyah didn't know what to do. She was a woman of action, but what action could she take against a shadowy past that was coming back to haunt them? What could they do against something that had been buried for decades? And then it hit her. "Amara," she whispered, her voice shaking. "What if this is why Grandma kept so many secrets? What if she knew this was going to catch up with us?" Amara looked at her, her eyes wide with fear and disbelief. "Do you think she knew?" Aaliyah nodded slowly, a sense of dread creeping into her heart. "We need to find out the truth. All of it. No matter what." Dr. Carter leaned forward, his voice low but urgent. "Whatever you do, be careful. There are people who would do anything to keep the past buried. And now, you're part of that story." The twins left the office in a daze, their minds racing with the implications of everything they had just learned. What had their grandmother been involved in? What secrets had she kept hidden? And most importantly, how would they uncover the truth without losing everything they knew about themselves? Their journey had just begun, and they couldn't turn back now. The past had its grip on them, and it was only a matter of time before they would have to face it head-on. The air felt colder as the twins walked out of Dr. Carter's office, the weight of the conversation still heavy in their chests. They had barely spoken to each other since leaving the clinic, their minds consumed by the revelation that had turned their world upside down. Amara's hands trembled as she clutched her purse, and Aaliyah couldn't bring herself to look her sister in the eye, the silence between them thick with uncertainty. They knew that things had just shifted in a way neither of them had expected. A part of them, perhaps foolishly, had hoped that the DNA test would bring only answers to questions about distant relatives, quirky family traits, or a fun exploration of their ancestry. But instead, it had dredged up a dark chapter of their family's history, one that had been buried for decades. As they stepped into the car, the familiar hum of the engine felt distant and hollow. Aaliyah was the first to speak, though her voice lacked its usual confidence. "Amara, do you think Grandma knew? I mean, how could she not? If she was connected to this Victor Cole guy, to that murder, she must have known something." Amara glanced out the window, her thoughts lost in the haze of the passing streetlights. "I don't know. I don't know what to believe anymore. It's all too much to take in. It doesn't make sense. Grandma was always so loving, so kind. Could she really have been involved in something like that?" Aaliyah's hands gripped the steering wheel tighter, her knuckles turning white with the strain. "I don't know, but we need to figure out what happened. We can't let this slide. Our family doesn't deserve to be haunted by secrets, especially not ones like this." Amara turned to her sister, her eyes red-rimmed and heavy with the burden of the unknown. "But how? How do we even start? Dr. Carter said there's a connection to Victor Cole. Who is he? Why does it all trace back to him? Aaliyah didn't have an answer. In truth, she felt just as lost, just as powerless. She knew that they were about to dive into something far bigger than either of them could have ever anticipated. A murder case that had been closed for years, yet now, because of their DNA results, it had opened up a door they weren't ready to walk through. For the rest of the drive home, neither of them spoke much. The hum of the car engine was the only sound that filled the silence between them. As they pulled into their driveway, the night seemed darker than usual, the shadows stretching longer as if reaching out to them. The house that had once been a place of comfort and familiarity now felt like an unfamiliar territory, a place where answers were buried, waiting to be unearthed. Aaliyah cut the engine, her fingers still wrapped around the steering wheel. She didn't want to go inside. She didn't want to face the reality of what was waiting for them. The weight of the unknown was almost suffocating. "We need to go through Grandma's things," Aaliyah finally said, breaking the silence. "There has to be something in there, some kind of clue. She must have known something, and if she did, we need to know what it is." Amara hesitated, her gaze drifting toward the front door of their house. "I don't know if I'm ready for that. What if we find something we're not supposed to?" "We don't have a choice," Aaliyah insisted, her voice firm now, a renewed sense of determination taking root. "We can't just sit here and let this haunt us. If we don't look, if we don't uncover the truth, then we'll never know what's really going on. And we'll never be able to move forward." Amara nodded slowly, her shoulders heavy with reluctance, but she knew Aaliyah was right. The only way out of this labyrinth of questions and fear was through it, by uncovering whatever secrets had been locked away for so long. If there was anything to find in their grandmother's belongings, anything that could shed light on the truth, they needed to face it. They made their way upstairs in silence, each step a reminder of how much had changed. The room that had once been a sanctuary, a place where they had spent countless hours playing, talking, and simply being together, now felt like a mausoleum. The attic, where their grandmother's things were stored, was no longer a dusty memory lane but a dark vault holding things better left forgotten. The moment they opened the attic door, the familiar smell of old wood and musty boxes hit them, but it didn't bring the comfort it once had. Instead, it was a reminder of all that had been hidden for years. The piles of yellowing photo albums, the old furniture covered in faded sheets, and the boxes stuffed with clothes and trinkets now seemed to carry a weight far heavier than nostalgia. Aaliyah walked in first, her footsteps echoing in the stillness of the attic. Her heart pounded in her chest as she scanned the cluttered space, looking for something, anything, that could give them a clue. She moved toward a dusty old trunk in the corner, the one that had always intrigued her as a child. She remembered her grandmother's warnings to stay away from it. She had never understood why, but now, the thought of it felt like a key to unlocking whatever secrets had been buried. Amara, a few paces behind her, stood frozen. She wasn't sure she could bear to touch anything up here. The idea of going through their grandmother's things felt too intimate now, too invasive. But she knew, deep down, that it was the only way forward. As Aaliyah opened the trunk, a cloud of dust billowed into the air. She coughed and brushed it aside, her hands shaking as she lifted the lid. Inside, there were old letters, some of them tied with faded ribbons, as well as a few books and a small jewelry box. But what caught Aaliyah's eye was a thick envelope, sealed with wax. It was the kind of envelope you didn't expect to find in a place like this, an envelope that seemed to hold something important, something deliberate. Aaliyah pulled it out and examined it carefully. The seal on the back was still intact, the red wax hardened over the years, but unmistakably present. It didn't have a return address or any indication of who it was meant for. She turned it over in her hands, her mind racing with possibilities. Could this be something her grandmother had left for them? Or had it been hidden away for another reason entirely? "Amara," Aaliyah called softly, her voice shaking with a mix of excitement and dread. "Come look at this." Amara approached cautiously, her eyes landing on the envelope. She didn't need to ask what it was. The way Aaliyah was holding it, almost reverently, told her everything she needed to know. "What is it?" Amara asked, her voice barely a whisper. I don't know, Aaliyah said, her fingers hovering over the wax seal. But I think we need to open it. With a deep breath, Aaliyah carefully broke the seal. The sound of it cracking echoed in the quiet attic. As she opened the envelope, a series of old photographs and a single folded letter slid out. Aaliyah reached for the letter first, unfolding it with shaking hands. The letter, written in elegant script, had clearly aged over the years, but the ink was still legible. It was dated more than 30 years ago. Aaliyah felt her stomach drop as she began reading. To whoever may find this, the truth must remain hidden for the safety of my family. I regret the choices I've made, but I cannot undo what has been done. You must not follow the path of discovery. There are those who would go to any lengths to protect the truth, even if it means destroying what remains. The past is buried for a reason. Do not unearth it. For the sake of those who came before you, let it lie. The letter dropped from her hands, falling onto the pile of belongings in the trunk. Aaliyah's face was pale, her breath shallow. The message was clear, but it didn't give them any answers. It was a warning, one that had been left for a reason. Amara, do you think this letter was written by Grandma? Aaliyah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Amara, her face white with shock, nodded slowly. I think so. But, why would she leave this for us? Why didn't she tell us anything? Why did she hide this? The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, but they were still too scattered, too incomplete to form any clear picture. One thing was certain, though, their grandmother had known something, and she had done everything in her power to keep it hidden. But now, the truth was clawing its way to the surface, and the sisters were inextricably tied to it. They knew they couldn't stop now. The journey ahead would be dangerous, but there was no turning back. The secrets had already begun to unravel. And no matter how dark or painful the truth might be, they would face it, together. The weight of the letter lingered in the air, thick and suffocating. Aaliyah and Amara stood frozen in the attic, staring at the faded pages that seemed to hold the weight of their family's darkest secrets. The letter, which had been so carefully concealed for decades, was now in their hands, yet it only raised more questions than it answered. They had hoped for a revelation, something to guide them forward, but instead, all they had was a cryptic warning, a plea to stop digging, to leave the past buried where it lay. Aaliyah's fingers brushed over the paper, feeling the ink that had once been sharp and deliberate, now blurred with time. She wanted to understand it, to decode the message her grandmother had left behind, but the words seemed to mock her, teasing her with their vagueness. Do not unearth it. Those words echoed in her mind like a drumbeat, relentless and ominous. What had her grandmother been trying to protect? And who were the those she had mentioned? Were there people still out there who wanted to keep the truth hidden? Amara stood beside her, her face pale, her eyes distant. She hadn't spoken since reading the letter, and Aaliyah could sense the turmoil brewing inside her. It wasn't just the letter that was unsettling, it was the entire situation. The DNA results had connected them to a murder case from the past, a case that seemed to have ties to their family, and now, their grandmother's final words made it clear that they had crossed a line. There was something far bigger at play here than either of them had imagined. We can't just let it go, Aaliyah said finally, her voice determined, though her heart was heavy with doubt. Whatever Grandma was trying to protect, it's clear that we need to understand what happened. We can't ignore this. Amara's gaze flickered to the box of old photographs that still sat on the floor, untouched. Her hand clenched at her side, and for a moment, Aaliyah thought she might walk away, might choose to close the attic door and pretend like none of this had ever happened. But Amara didn't walk away. Instead, she took a deep breath and nodded slowly. I know. But what if we're wrong? What if we're digging up something that's better left forgotten? What if we're putting ourselves in danger? Aaliyah didn't have an answer to that. She wanted to say that everything would be fine, that the truth was something they needed to uncover, but deep down, she felt the same fear. There was a reason her grandmother had hidden these things away. There was a reason she had sealed that letter with such urgency, as if it were a life or death matter. But at the same time, Aaliyah couldn't live with the idea of just walking away. Not when there was a chance to uncover the truth, to unravel the mystery that had haunted them for so long. Amara sighed, the sound heavy with frustration. We can't just keep sitting here in the dark. We need to know more. We need to understand what this has to do with us, with Grandma, and with that man, Victor Cole. If he's the one connected to the murder, then why are we suddenly tied to him? What's the real story? Aaliyah nodded, a sense of resolve settling over her. Let's go through the rest of her things. Maybe there's something in her journals or letters that will help us understand more. If there's a connection to Victor Cole, we need to find it. They spent the next few hours in the attic, carefully sifting through old boxes, photo albums, and forgotten mementos. As they moved through their grandmother's belongings, each item seemed to hold a piece of the past, a fragment of a life that had been carefully concealed. The more they searched, the more they uncovered details that seemed to suggest a life filled with mystery and unspoken truths. There were photographs of their grandmother with a man Aaliyah didn't recognize, a man whose face was etched with the same coldness that seemed to haunt the darkest corners of their family history. There were letters between her grandmother and someone named Margaret, who Aaliyah assumed was a close friend, though the tone of the correspondence felt secretive, as if there were things left unsaid between them. But it was a small leather-bound journal, wedged between two large boxes of antique silverware, that changed everything. It was almost as if it had been waiting for them to find it, its presence undeniable in the sea of forgotten memories. Aaliyah hesitated for a moment, her fingers brushing over the cover. It felt significant, heavier than anything else they had found. Without a word, she opened it, and the faint smell of old paper filled the air as she flipped through the pages. Her heart skipped a beat when she saw the familiar handwriting, her grandmother's. The journal was filled with entries that were a mixture of daily life and cryptic thoughts. At first glance, they appeared to be nothing more than the ramblings of a woman growing older, recounting her days with mundane details. But as Aaliyah read further, the entries became darker, more frantic. Her grandmother's handwriting grew messier, more hurried, as if she were writing down thoughts that she was afraid would escape her if she didn't act quickly. The first few pages were harmless enough, stories about gardening, visits to the local market, and interactions with neighbors. But then, in a late entry dated just a year before her passing, Aaliyah found something that made her blood run cold. I've seen him again. I thought I was done with it, but it's never over. Victor Cole is still out there, and I fear that he's not finished with me. He's watching, waiting. The deal we made, it wasn't enough. It never is. I tried to escape it once, and now I see that I can't. He's involved in everything, the murder, the lies, the destruction of so many lives. And now, it's coming for me, for my family. I can't protect them anymore. I can only pray they don't suffer the way I have. I've done things I regret. I've made deals I shouldn't have made. And now, I'm paying the price. Aaliyah felt the journal slip from her hands as the words sank in. Her heart pounded in her chest, and she turned to Amara, whose face had gone ashen as she read over her shoulder. This isn't just about Victor Cole, Amara whispered, her voice thick with disbelief. This isn't just a murder case. This is something so much bigger than we thought. Grandma. Grandma was involved with him, wasn't she? She had to have been. Aaliyah couldn't speak. Her mind was spinning, her stomach churning with the realization that the woman they had loved and cherished had been entangled in something so dark, so dangerous. The deal she had made, the things she had done, had placed her family directly in harm's way. They had only scratched the surface of something that had been buried for decades, but now, the weight of it all was crashing down on them. The twins sat in stunned silence, the journal open between them, each page revealing more of their grandmother's fears and regrets. The final entries were the most disturbing. In one, written just days before her death, their grandmother had written, "I can't keep hiding. The truth is catching up with me, and I don't know how much longer I can protect my family. I've kept the secrets for too long, but they will come to light, and when they do, nothing will ever be the same." Aaliyah closed the journal with trembling hands, her mind reeling. "We need to find Victor Cole," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "We need to confront him. We need to understand what he did to Grandma, what he did to our family." Amara nodded, her face pale but resolute. "We're already in this too deep. If we don't confront him now, we may never get the chance." But deep down, Aaliyah knew that finding Victor Cole wouldn't be as simple as confronting a man. They were chasing a shadow, a man whose grip on their family's past ran deeper than they had ever imagined. And now, they were caught in the storm that had been brewing for decades, a storm that was about to engulf them all. The next few days passed in a blur of uncertainty and dread. Aaliyah and Amara, both now irrevocably tethered to a past they hadn't known existed, found themselves caught in a whirlwind of emotions. Every conversation, every glance between them, seemed to carry the weight of their family's untold history. The journal, with its cryptic and chilling entries, had only deepened the mystery. It was no longer just about Victor Cole, or even the long-buried murder case. It was about their grandmother's life, about the choices she had made, the secrets she had kept, and the sinister forces that had seemingly surrounded her for years. Their world, once stable and familiar, had crumbled, revealing cracks and shadows they could never have anticipated. Aaliyah couldn't stop thinking about the last entry in the journal. Their grandmother had written, almost as if in her final moments, that the truth was catching up with her. But what was that truth? What had she been hiding? And most pressing of all, what was their connection to Victor Cole? It was a question that had become an obsession, gnawing at her every waking moment. She spent hours scouring the internet, looking for any trace of Victor Cole. But the man seemed to exist in a strange sort of purgatory. He was neither fully a criminal, nor entirely a phantom. There were records of his involvement in various shady dealings, but nothing concrete. No definitive story. He was a name, a whisper in the dark, and no matter how many articles she read or reports she dug through, she found nothing that tied him directly to their family, nothing but the DNA test. Amara, on the other hand, had been quieter than usual, retreating into herself in ways Aaliyah wasn't sure how to handle. She spent her time sifting through their grandmother's letters, hoping to find something else, anything that would make sense of it all. But even as they delved deeper into the mystery, the more questions they unearthed. There was a pattern, a web of connections they could barely comprehend, and it felt as if their very existence had become entwined in it. It was almost as though the past had been waiting for them to open that first box, to take that first step into a world that had been hidden for too long. One afternoon, Aaliyah couldn't take it any longer. She had to know more. The overwhelming need to understand their grandmother's life, to uncover the full extent of her involvement, pushed her to make a decision. She called Amara into the living room, the sense of finality in her voice making Amara look up from her notebook. There was no turning back from this moment. The search for Victor Cole had become their mission, no matter the cost. "We need to find him. We need to confront him directly," Aaliyah said, her voice unwavering, despite the uncertainty that churned inside her. Amara looked at her, the conflict evident in her eyes. "Are you sure? What if we can't find him? What if he's long gone or—" "He's not gone," Aaliyah interrupted, her gaze hard. "He's somewhere. He's been watching us, or he's been watching Grandma for years. We need to find the connection, Amara. If we don't do this, we'll never get the answers we need. This won't just go away." Amara hesitated, her eyes flickering to the stack of papers on the table. She knew Aaliyah was right, but the gravity of what they were about to do, the risks they were about to take, felt too much to bear. Could they really step into this unknown world? Could they truly confront a man like Victor Cole, knowing nothing about him other than the fact that he had been part of their family's darkest chapter? "I don't know if I'm ready for this," Amara whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of the uncertainty. "What if we get in over our heads? What if we uncover something we can't control?" "We're already in over our heads," Aaliyah said firmly, her eyes locking with her sister's. "We can't go back now. It's time to face the truth." Amara swallowed hard, looking at Aaliyah, then back at the table, as if searching for something to ground her. She wasn't sure whether she was scared or angry, but there was something else beneath the fear. There was a fire, a determination to seek answers, even if those answers were dangerous. "Okay," Amara said finally, her voice steadying. "Let's do it. Let's find him." They spent the next few days following a trail of cold leads and dead ends. They visited the addresses they had found online, but each one turned out to be a ghost of the past. Old buildings, new tenants, and whispers of Victor Cole's name, but no actual proof that he was still around. It was maddening, a never-ending cycle of chasing shadows. But then, one evening, as they were poring over an old newspaper article they had found from the 1980s, something clicked. The article was about a man named Victor Cole, but it wasn't just any piece of reporting. The article described a man who had been linked to several high-profile murders, unsolved cases that had shaken the city. It also mentioned that, after a brief stint in prison, Cole had disappeared, leaving behind only rumors. The final lines of the article caught Aaliyah's attention. Victor Cole is believed to have connections to several influential people, but his current whereabouts remain a mystery. Some speculate that he has gone underground, while others believe that he may have assumed a new identity. Aaliyah felt a cold chill run down her spine. He was still out there. He had gone into hiding, and if the rumors were true, he was untouchable. But it didn't matter. They were too close now. The breakthrough came when Amara found a contact, someone who had been a former associate of Victor Cole. It wasn't much, just a name, but it was enough to fuel their determination. A man named David Carter, a former lawyer, had worked with Cole years ago. According to the records, Carter had mysteriously left the country around the same time Cole had disappeared. They had no way of knowing whether Carter knew anything about their family or the connection to their grandmother, but it was their best lead. Aaliyah and Amara set out to find him, their resolve hardening with every passing hour. The search had taken them to unexpected places, pushing them to the edge of their comfort zones, but now they were on the brink of something monumental. They reached out to Carter's last known address, a small townhouse in a quiet suburban neighborhood that felt too normal, too peaceful, for what they were about to uncover. When they arrived, the door was answered by a woman, David Carter's wife, as it turned out. She was an older woman, her eyes tired but sharp. When they mentioned Carter's name, her face shifted, her expression suddenly wary. She hesitated before allowing them in, her gaze flickering toward the hallway as if she were weighing the decision to speak. "I don't know why you're looking for him," she said quietly, her voice shaking slightly. "David hasn't been the same since he left. He's not the man he once was." Aaliyah and Amara exchanged a glance. This was it. They were getting closer to the truth. The woman led them to a back room where David Carter sat, his back hunched, his face pale and drawn. He looked up when they entered, his eyes darting nervously between them. "I can't help you," he said, his voice hoarse, as if the words had been choking him for years. "You don't understand what you're asking. You don't understand what you've stumbled into." Aaliyah stepped forward, her heart pounding. "We need to know about Victor Cole. We need to know what happened, what he did to our grandmother, and why her name was connected to him." David Carter flinched as though he had been struck, his face blanching even further. He opened his mouth to speak, but then closed it, as if the words were too much to bear. For a long moment, there was silence, heavy, suffocating silence. Finally, David spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "You have no idea what you're asking," he murmured, looking down at his hands. "You have no idea the kind of man Victor Cole was, or what your grandmother was involved in. She thought she was protecting you by keeping it all hidden, but now it's too late. The truth will destroy everything." Aaliyah's chest tightened. "What truth? What happened?" David's eyes flickered toward the door, and then back at the sisters. He was shaking now, his entire body betraying the fear that had consumed him. "The truth is that your grandmother made a deal with Victor Cole, a deal that cost more than anyone realized. She wasn't just protecting herself, she was protecting you. But now that you've come looking for answers, you've stirred up something that should have remained buried." And with those words, the final pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. The darkness that had been waiting for them was now unavoidable. The truth was no longer something they could ignore, it was coming for them, and there was no turning back. The storm was about to hit, and they were at the center of it.